I'd like to now introduce Justin Jonson. Justin is Managing Director of Threshold Environmental Proprietary Limited, a consultancy designing and implementing large-scale reconstruction in sclerophyll ecosystems in arid zones, semi-arid zones in Western Australia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Teen. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here. And it's also a real opportunity to go after Nigel. I was amazed to hear you say, Nigel, that you've been in the field for 30 years, because I just realized today when coming to this talk that I've been in the field for 15 years approximately, and I would sort of make the date San Juan, Puerto Rico, 1999, where I saw you give a talk on the Donaghy's corridor, and I'll never forget that. You know, it was possibly one of the reasons why I'm here in Australia. So it's a really quite an amazing feeling to be here with all of you as well, because it really sort of shows me how connected we all are in strange ways, supporting each other through inspiring each other and really pushing each other to work hard. And I'd also quite grateful to be here with Keith Bradby as well from the Gondwana project, because without opportunities to practice, you don't really get to give it a go. And 15 years of being in the field, but only really practicing for 8 or less, so it's a hard slog, and you got to really work hard to get these sort of projects up and running. And I've had the great fortune to have that happen, and so I want to share with you what I think are some of the interesting things that you might find interesting as well about my experience in the southwest of WA. I'm originally from New York, so probably southwest WA. Albany is probably about the opposite side of the planet from where I was born, but I guess that's my journey for now. And yeah, it's been a very interesting experience. Like I mentioned, I've had the great privilege of being able to work as a part of the Gondwana project. And briefly, the audacious vision of the Gondwana project is to reconnect the wet forests of the Southwest to the arid interior of basically the deserts in Kalgoorlie. And the reason why the project has come to be is because this area has relatively large areas of intact ecosystems. So as you may be aware of, you can see the wheat belt there. It's 18 million hectares, and it's 93% cleared. So focusing on the areas where there are actually intact ecosystems that we can build on and support is a really important first step. And if you notice in the image, there's a section of an operational area called the Fitz-Sirling operational area, which reconnects the Stirling Range National Parks and the Fitzgerald River National Park. So that's the area where I've been working for the last 8 years or so. Here's an image of the Fitz-Sirling landscape. And as you can see, there's 2 national parks. There's a 70-kilometer gap in between them. It's a fragmented agricultural landscape, which is mainly cropping and grazing. Very large farms, 1,000 hectares is sort of the normal size, but there's bigger farms as well. And as you can also notice, in the middle of that landscape, there's 2 very large reserves, which aren't national parks, but they're large intact bits of bush that weren't cleared, fortunately, as they developed that landscape. And because of those intact remnant areas, it provides an opportunity for us to see a vision of reconnecting this gap in the landscape. Incredibly species-rich ecosystems in both the Fitzgerald River National Park and the Stirling Ranges National Park. The dark green properties, which you can see, are basically properties that have been purchased either by environmental NGOs or conservation-focused landholders, or who have bought to contribute to the vision of Gondwana, which is basically to restore the ecological connectivity and health of the landscape. We're here to talk about reconstruction and in the context of ecological restoration. So I guess this image, this diagram, has always really sort of struck a note for me, and I really liked the way that it presented the concepts of what we're trying to do for ecological restoration. So if you look at an intact ecosystem, you've got a lot of ecological functionality, and basically you're up here in this state. And if a disturbance happens which knocks it down to a lower state, the resilience of the system is whether or not it can pump back into that upper state on its own, or whether it just suddenly becomes, there's a bit of a hump there, there's a bit of a threshold that needs to be crossed for it to go back up into a higher state. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the section down here. This is the landscape we find ourselves in, is at the bottom of the ladder, so to speak, or the bottom of the stairs. And so, we're trying to figure out how we're going to get it up up the ladder towards a restored, intact ecosystem that has function, or at least move it up, improve it. So another aspect that's been really great fortune for me is joining the Gondwana Link initiative is that there were other practitioners who were out there doing work before I arrived. And so I had the benefit of coming in and seeing some previous works that had been done and looking at them and saying, okay, what's going on here? And trying to apply that sort of ecological thinking to what I was observing on the ground to see whether or not there were opportunities to modify practice. And so this site here is Cheraninup, which is a bush heritage property where 70 hectares, the cleared area that you can see there is a 70-hectare area that had been cleared, and it had been replanted by a local contractor that worked in the area for restoration. What I did is I went up and set some plots up to try and measure what was coming up. And when I did that, I could see that there was basically, first of all, this Melaleuca acuminata sort of jumped out as a species that was really quite abundant out there. It showed basically that there was really strong viability of this species. So putting a little bit into the mix, and suddenly we've got a massive amount of recruitment, but yet it's also competing. And I guess it's the one point of difference I found from the rainforest, just getting some species out there and then the rest will come, is in an arid ecosystem, it's basically what you put there is what you've got for quite a long time because it's a dispersal limited flora. There's not a lot of flow of seeds into the area once you get it established, and in fact there might be very little. Even the birds, there's not much fruits there for them to eat. And so what you start with is pretty much what you're stuck with. And so the other thing that I observed was the high eucalypt densities, 12,000 stems in one of the plots. So this sort of got us thinking about, we really need to be thinking strongly about the initial conditions that we're starting with, getting our seed rates right. And there was a lot of other ecological theory that I was really interested in learning as I was getting involved in the field that was going to sort of inform how do we get from where we are to something better, because we have to always be working on an improvement model if we want to achieve sort of restoration, because let's be honest, it's pretty hard to restore ecosystems. It's not something for the faint-hearted. I'm not going to go into the details of all of this ecological theory here. The point is just that understanding the ecological theory is helpful to then, when you go into your practice, to be informed by that theory. It helps you come up with innovative approaches. So my first project, what I was able to try out some of these ideas, was the Pennyup property, which is a property that was purchased by Greening Australia and Bush Heritage with support from the Nature Conservancy as part of the Gondwana Link project. Very large property, 2,500 hectares. At this point, it's been subdivided in the middle, with the southern section, which is mainly where the main remnant vegetation is been in the ownership of Bush Heritage, and the northern section, which is cleared, is Greening Australia. And so the idea for the Pennyup project was, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? So the first thing we said is, let's try and reestablish diverse plant communities that are resilient, self-replicating, ecologically informed. So in other words, we're not just going to make a mixed soup of all the species that are local in our region and throw them out there. We want to try and look to what is actually happening in the surrounding environment and try to replicate what they're doing. So in other words, use reference ecosystems. And also to support a heterogeneous mosaic. So I really liked what Nigel mentioned about the edges, because there's no sense making if you've got a project to restore 100 hectares, there's no sense just making one seed mix and spreading it all out there, because you basically have a homogeneous mix of species that you're not maximizing habitat value. The edges are those exciting spots where you have a diversity of structure, you have a diversity of species contrast, and so they support different fauna. So certain birds might like a small tight scrub environment for their preferred habitat. Other birds might like an open woodland. So creating a heterogeneous mosaic seems to be a critical thing to be thinking about if you really want to restore for habitat values. So I'm just going to walk through the planning that went through this project, just to give you that idea of how we brought it together. And so the first thing was, when the property was purchased, I got in the car with the departing farmer who had farmed the place for 30 years, and hadn't made much money out of it because it was a very difficult bit of land to farm, very challenging environment. And so I got in the car and I said, look, could you tell me a little bit about your history here? Can you take me around the site and tell me about the farm, about your paddocks and stuff? And I talked a bit of agricultural stuff, what about your production and things like that? And so we got in the car and he basically took me around and he said, oh yeah, there's some good soils up here, and this area gets a bit waterlogged, and oh, you've got a white clay strip through here, really heavy white clays. And I just quickly jotted down all of those notes because I realized that through the years of him being on the tractor and tilling up that soil, he had a better idea of that site than we were going to get unless we were going to farm it for 30 years, which we weren't going to do. The first step was really capturing that knowledge from the farmer before he left. And then the next step was, okay, we've got that bit of knowledge. Now, what's next? What other information can we throw into our sort of analysis to decide how to restore this block? Because it's a big responsibility. And so we had Department of Agriculture had some soil maps, but they were very broad, regional mapping. And also there was a local vegetation map that had been put together, which again was helpful, but in the context of the diversity in this region and the fact that it was mainly cleared in this landscape, it only gave us some ideas. And I think that's one of the things that's really important about planning is you got to draw in as many strings of information as you can, and then you process it. You get the best. What you've got is what you've got. So you got to get it and take advantage of it. But don't think of anything as like a Bible or anything like that. So to try and dig deeper, I found out about this stuff called gamma radiometrics, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but apparently the Earth gives off gamma rays from the center, and you can use an instrument that measures gamma radiation, and that instrument gives an estimate of the amount of thorium, potassium, and uranium that is in the upper meter of the soil. The Department of Agriculture had done some mapping of the area for mining purposes, and so it was another layer to throw into the mix of our knowledge of the site. And so I'll just leave it at that it was another layer of information that we could draw on. I could get into the specifics of it, but it would take too long. And the other bit is a digital elevation model. So, I've sort of covered, soils, the landholder, digital elevation model. I've failed to mention that we also took some measurements of the remnant vegetation that were on the site, a remnant paddock tree here. And all this stuff was done with a handheld GIS unit, which I think every restoration practitioner project should have strong data collection. You've got to be collecting data and looking at these things on ArcGIS and cross-referencing things, and that's how you really going to get to really get an accurate idea when you've got basically a landscape that's been cleared and you don't have any records of what was there before. So the final step was to go out and do some intensive soil sampling. So I sampled about 100 pits with a hand auger. It was really hard work, and I had no idea really what I was going to find. But the results from capturing the data, I basically recorded the changes in profile, texture, color, and the distance between the different changes in the soil profile for all those plots that I again then added into a GIS database and had the Excel spreadsheet to cross-reference. And then looking at the other input layers, able to come up with a proposed restoration map, which incorporated the farmer notes, the remnant veg notes, the ag soil notes, newbie vegetation layer, the gamma radiometric information and the digital elevation model, plus the soil augered pits to establish basically 9 broad soil landforms that we were going to try to restore. So concurrently, while we were doing this mapping, we were also going out with the botanist, and I'm a strong believer of being on the ground. So all of these activities, I was sort of right there learning from the experts. Obviously, the botany in this area is mega diverse. We were able to record 240 species on the site, but there's probably 400, in excess of 400. And at this point, we weren't really aware of what the vegetation associations were in this landscape because it's such a mega diverse landscape. It hasn't actually been mapped and defined into little vegetation associations at this point, but we're getting there. So 240 species were ID'd, but the seed pickers could only collect 120 species. So for a number of reasons, time, money, availability, and also, we're trying to restore a large area. This is a big project. I haven't mentioned it's a 250 hectare project. That's got a slide coming up a little bit later. But, we have to get bulk. We have to have a lot of seed because it's a big area and there's a number of filters which are going to prevent these species from establishing. And this is the first one, what you can get. So these initial conditions are critical, and this wouldn't even been able to be achieved if we didn't have expert local seed picker on the project. So once we had the soil landform map developed, we then sat down with the botanist and the seed pickers, and we said, right, let's talk about the species that we've collected, our 120. What type of soils do they like? What type of positions in the landscape are they in? What do they grow with? And using that information, we designed 9 different soil veg associations that are replicating a reference ecosystem. We didn't, in this specific project, we didn't actually have a specific reference sites that we were actually comparing it to. So this is 2008. We didn't have that sort of information. We were doing the best we had with what we had at the time. But this approach is a fantastic approach because in the end we found that we've actually done really well. And the other aspect to it is the functionality. You see down here in the blue, we've got nitrogen fixers. So we made a special point to make sure that we were including nitrogen fixing species and also proteaceous species in red. And we've also got the main structural elements: tall mallees, tall shrubs, mid shrubs, low shrubs, very low shrubs, other. So in this example, you've got the gravel system. You can see in the blue, and you can see it on the map here. And it's approximately 8% of the system. And then here's another example, the upland Yates system. So you can see the pink here in the map there, and approximately 22% of the system. So that was the planning. So now for the implementation. Another part of sort of being in the landscape is going and visiting previous sites that have been done, previous restoration projects. What have they done? What has occurred? Fortunately, by working for Greening Australia, I had the luxury to do that. So I visited a lot of sites, and one of the things that sort of struck me in all these sites was this lack of recruitment in these arid ecosystems. So some of these plantings are 20 years old, and the tree belts in between the seeding belts, these are direct seeded sites. In between the direct seeded areas, there's very little recruitment, and there's very little weeds. The site's been captured by eucalypts, and it just struck me, if we're trying to restore habitat, this doesn't seem like it's got the sort of structural layout that we want, because to me, I just think of like a fox walking down that row, or a cat looking for little birds like at night, like, what was that? And just like these highways that they can just hunt on. So I had a look at what was happening with the equipment that was being used by practitioners, and I found that there was this like 3-meter spacing, row spacing, that for some reason was the trend. It was what people were doing. And even though there was some attempts to sort of modify seed layout this is 2 different seeding rows here. Within that, so there's a little bit of a tight row there, which is nice, but still you've got this big gap between this other row. And I visited other sites, and again and again, I keep on seeing this 3-meter, 3.5 meter, 2.7 meter. And I started thinking about this idea of assemblage and creating sort of habitat, and I thought, we can do better than this. So we took a risk, and we decided, let's try and change that. So we actually just got an old Great Plains cedar, which interestingly, there's some farmers in the landscape who are still actually using this to seed their crops. But we modified it for direct seeding, and what we did is we said, right, let's put 5 rows, because the other thing is there was an issue with scale. Gondwana Lake, massive area, 70 kilometers. We're talking 10,000 hectares that we want to restore. We're not really going to do that with little toe behind the ute cedars. We need something that can cover large areas. And so this was an attempt to try and do that. And if you're traveling at 6 kilometers an hour, you could do 4.2 hectares an hour, and you've got a 1.4 meter spacing in between the rows. So the idea is to see whether or not we could get a small shrub growing here that could connect with a small shrub growing there. So I'm not going to really get into the agronomy too much in this presentation, but it's a major component of the program. And basically my feeling is all restoration programs, they got to be on top of their agronomy. They got to be on top of what they need to do to beat their weeds, what they need to do to how deep to sow their seeds, what kind of equipment they need, what kind of insect treatments they need to use. I'll just quickly point out, we're just using agricultural off-the-shelf cedars here. And this back row here is what's setting the depth. You can adjust that back row. There's a picture of me measuring the depth of how much our double disc openers are cutting the soil before planting the seeds. And here's a little picture of the ruler on the side there. So we were going for 0 to 10 mil. That was what we were going for, preferably around 5 mil depth. That's what we've found. That's what the local knowledge has found is the best sort of depth for direct seeding. I mean, some people were sprinkling Melaleucas on the surface. Go to the best knowledge, do that, and apply it. So in 2008, Greening Australia was able to secure funding from Mirabella Light Bulb Company to jointly fund a carbon-funded ecological restoration project. So 250 hectares of the plan. I put this up here to show that because it was a carbon-funded project, you know, oftentimes with sort of investments in these sorts of things, there's trade-offs. So, for instance, if you're restoring something along a road verge or something like that, there might be some height restrictions on what plants you can put in or something like that. In this instance, it was carbon, so we had to make sure we were going to get at least a minimum stocking because direct seeding is it's becoming more and more reliable. But the truth of the matter is, there have been sites that have been done where there's big patches that nothing's come up. And so to ensure that the carbon was there, we also implemented these tree belts. It's not a separate system. We put the same understory that we put in the rest of the areas. We just added hand planting of the same eucalypts that we were direct seeding in those areas. So it was just an insurance mechanism. The other thing it did is these tree belts, I shot these all with a contour, laser level, 10 centimeter accuracy. So in terms of catching water, these are also a very, very powerful functional treatment, which, let's face it, in these arid ecosystems, water is the constraint to growth. So that was the carbon. But the other thing is, like, this is an ecological restoration project. We're not in it for the carbon. We're in it for the ecological restoration. So if we're going to do stuff for carbon, we've also got to do stuff for ecological restoration. And this slide sort of shows one of my favorite concepts connected to ecological restoration is broad brushstrokes and fine detail. Ecological restoration is a combination of science, and there's a bit of art in there as well. And so the metaphor is appropriate because, yeah, sure, we're direct seeding this big area with a biodiverse seed mix in this system here, a biodiverse seed mix to hope that we're going to recruit. But by putting in these little dots, they're called nodes, basically. And what it is we found that their proteaceous species were very difficult to collect large amounts of seed. They had very difficult recruiting requirements. And so basically we thought, let's clump them together, and then if we clump them together, then they can provide a lot of functions. Number one, they can be like areas for birds to come in, where there's all of a sudden all this flowering in a small area. And then as well, if there's more than one, we don't have birds competing for the same resources. Also, the birds can pollinate them. And quite frankly, we don't have enough seed to be posting out all around the landscape. So this is what the site looked like after we direct seeded it. Not very impressive, eh? So, my supervisors came out there and they had a look at it and they, oh, this doesn't look good, Justin, and I was just, a little bit worried. So I thought, okay, I'm going to establish some monitoring. So I banged in 42 plots across the different ecosystems and measured every recruit that came up using a tape measure to say, okay, well, let's see what we've got. And with that, we were able to get a snapshot of, okay, step one, what have we got? We made an effort, we put some seed in, what came out? And so here you can see some of the results of the monitoring, and you can see the results also show that we're getting some of these preferred structural areas. So you've got open gaps, but you've also got dense little clusters. And this is the sort of scale we're operating at. So this is an aerial view of that of the upper site. So it's big property. I was going to go into another project. I'll quickly do it. Learning from that project and going on to a new project, we lifted the bar. We learned from our previous efforts, and we did detailed vegetation surveys, which 211 species identified on the site, but an average of only 20 per 20 by 20 meter quadrat. And we followed a botanical hierarchical two-way ranking system to group the plants into vegetation associations, and we were able to define 10 different plant communities within that area, within the local surrounding area. Then we went in and did some detailed soil sampling, again, just like we did at Penny-Up, and created a map of the site, a restoration map. But this is only a first pass, because when the offer to do a contract, which was to restore this area here, just this paddock here, came in, we realized that our 400-hectare scale didn't really mean much anymore, because now we're at the 100-hectare scale. So we looked back at the soil records and we said, oh, look, we can refine this. We can have more different seed mixes involved, and we can do a better job. And so we went about it the same way as before, following the agronomy. We tried new techniques. This is burning some of the sclerophyll, whatever, the stuff that needs fire. Hard to collect seed of that. So look, we don't have it, we need it in, let's burn it on site. And these are the tractor passes, so it's a lot of detailed work, always about the detail. We expanded the nodes. So previously you saw a few little dots, now we've got mega dots. And this image just shows that it's a constant improvement. So here's the 2012 contract. The diameter of the circle is the number of seedlings in the node. Here's the 2013 contract. So again, more contrast, just innovating, trying to lift the bar, trying to improve. Let's see what happens. That's the approach. Again, monitoring, detailed monitoring. We've got to see what's coming up, because we can't modify and we can't figure out what the fauna response is later if we don't know what the underlying information is. So there you go.